Welcome to Reaction with me, Iain Martin, editor of Reaction, and welcome to the latest of our in conversation author series with Alwyn Turner, discussing his book All in It Together: England in the Early 21st Century. Frightening to think that that period is already history, if you're of a certain age anyway. That is frightening. Welcome.
Hello.
So the first thing I wanted to address is really the theme that comes through really strongly in the book is this idea of a loss of authority. As you say towards the end, faith in authority had frayed badly. The monarchy and the armed forces in that period, and we're talking about 2000 to roughly 2015, or just before the referendum on leaving the EU. But you say the monarchy and the armed forces are okay, but other institutions in that period have taken a real knock. What happens, do you think?
I think it's a series of things that seem to be unrelated, where people lose faith in journalism because of the phone hacking, in the BBC with a whole range of stories, in Parliament and politics because of the expenses scandal and the fallout from the Iraq war. There's a whole load of institutions that all seem to suffer crises during this period. And I think there may be a connection between them all. I think it may be to do with the rise of the internet and people's wish to challenge and to have their voices heard directly, and feeling that the institutions are left over from an earlier time and don't seem to have adapted very well to this new world. But it does seem to me that that's been very much the story of recent decades.
Yes, I mean, that's very clear, isn't it? Something like the loss of faith in media. I mean, it's also accompanied by the rise of what's referred to in the book at several points, interestingly, as IT. Mm-hmm. Takes you back that, information technology was the way all of this was described. But you got this incredible rise in the 2000s when lots of us were still saying, will this nonsense ever really catch on? And it's changing our world possibly at a faster pace than we appreciate at the time, and doing all sorts of strange things, particularly to media.
It has changed. I think the psychology of the nation as much as anything else. It's not simply about the technology. It's about the fact that people now feel that they can speak for themselves, and they don't need a media or a political class between them and representing. It feels as if, I mean, I quote Peter Mandelson in the 1990s saying that the age of representative democracy may be coming to an end. Mm. And I still think this is a serious consideration. We are still at incredibly early days of the internet. I mean, this has only been in existence for 30 years or so, the World Wide Web, and we still don't really know where it's going to take us.
Yeah, I've always thought it is presented as a chilling comment by Mandelson, but I think it's actually quite prescient, and I think he's onto something that when you begin writing this series, and I should point out this is the latest in a series of books examining the latter decades of the 20th century. It begins with the first is called Crisis about the 1970s. But I suppose what Mandelson's getting at there also in terms of media is the way that I remember him talking about this in great depth as well, is the way in which readers or viewers feel that they can have a direct say, a theme which runs through your latest book with voting on television shows, talent shows, all of that. But also readers could then, rather than just have to write to a newspaper, possibly not be published, but be edited, they could go direct onto the message board and have their say. So it's a bit, and that very clearly then has an impact on notions of authority. Let's go back towards the beginning of the book. It was the second chapter, and 9/11. I mean, it's the trigger for huge change.
It is, I think, and it's because I think it's because Tony Blair was in such a special position as a prime minister. I mean, the gloss had come off a little bit during his first term, but still he was seen as being a break with the past. That very long period of the Tory government of 18 years that had come to an end in such an appalling way that it just kind of dragged itself over the last couple of years in a wallowing in sleaze and all of that stuff that it had been attacked for. And Tony Blair was this clean pair of hands. He was a pretty straight kind of guy, and he was going to be different to everything that had gone before, and he was going to be beyond reproach. And I think the problem that came was when it was concluded by a very large section of society that he had lied over the Iraq War. 9/11 and our immediate response to that had public support, and the intervention in Afghanistan, I think, had public support. That seemed to be relevant and proportionate to the outrage of 9/11. And it was against America, our closest ally, and I think people were on board with that. But then Iraq changes it, and I don't think we've ever fully recovered in terms of our faith in politics and the political system. I don't think we've recovered from that, and it's because it was Tony Blair who was supposed to be different. And if not even he could be trusted, then how could you trust any politicians?
What do you think happens to Blair in that period? Why is he radicalized? I mean, he obviously does genuinely feel this sense of threat, doesn't he? He feels that the possibility of technological advances, weapons of mass destruction, and Islamist terrorism, all of that combined, he gets a very doom-ridden vision of the future. So he does believe it, but does his personality change, or does something come out in him that was already there?
I think that's that sense of him having a destiny of being one of the great prime ministers is there. Maybe that's true of all prime ministers. I mean, why would you want the job if you didn't think you were going to be the one who changed the country, or in his case, changed the world? He feels like a man in search of a mission. He was getting not much traction with his reforms on the domestic agenda. He kept on talking about how he needed to completely change the mentality of public services, and he was going to be the revolutionary in terms of how health and education was provided. And he kept on getting stymied on that, partly by his own party and by Gordon Brown, but also because it just didn't seem as if it was something that one person could change. These are vast institutions, and they don't lend themselves to messianic work. They lend themselves to committees and piecemeal reforms. And Tony Blair was, as I say, feels like a man in search of a mission, and undoubtedly believes it. I don't think there's conscious deception at all. But he is wrong, which is the crucial bit. I mean, if he's that concerned about weapons of mass destruction, he does get it wrong. And the conclusion from many people's position was that he must therefore have lied, because how could he have got it wrong? And Robin Cook, for example, sitting next to him in the cabinet, gets it right and says there are no weapons of mass destruction. They've seen the same information, and Blair has come to a different conclusion because he is looking for something different, possibly.
I wonder if it is tied up with, and you put it really well there about Blair wanting to be consequential, wanting to be a great historical figure. And I wonder if that's because of who he followed, or seeing himself as almost the heir to Thatcher, although his politics are in many ways very different. But that actually there are other leaders, aren't there? And they feature in your earlier books, someone like Callaghan, who maybe Blair would have seen as a failure, or John Major until 1997, who saw themselves in quite different terms. I suppose they defined their politics by an idea of custodianship, that you try and make some individual changes and improvements, but you don't necessarily believe that you are a transformative historical figure or want to prove that. It's interesting with Blair is that Blair and Clinton found themselves in similar situations, and Clinton famously talks about how he felt disappointed that almost nothing happened. Well, lots of things happened, including the Rwanda massacre, but there wasn't a global conflict or a major challenge of the kind that he might have wanted to become that, a big figure like FDR or Truman or Woodrow Wilson. Instead, he was president at a time of pretty healthy economic growth, declining deficits, and all the rest of it. But then Blair is presented with 9/11, and that's his big moment in history.
Yeah, the alternative would have been if he'd made serious progress on Europe. That was the original concept of that was his mission, was that he was going to put Britain at the heart of Europe, was the great slogan before the 97 election. And then he finds resistance again within his own party and his own cabinet and next door with Gordon Brown over the question of whether we should join the euro. And if we're not going to join the euro, then clearly we are not at the heart of Europe. And so everything that he was intending to do, the European project, the reform of public services, he was getting nowhere at all. And I think you're right. There are prime ministers for whom this is fine. John Major was not looking to be the great transformative prime minister, possibly. But I think you're right. The image of Margaret Thatcher looms very heavily over the Blair premiership. And when you compare the two, I mean, Margaret Thatcher has slightly longer in office. She has another year or so on Blair, but the country was completely different by the end of Thatcher's time in office, in a way that it simply wasn't with Tony Blair. It's going back to the point about the internet. That's the thing that changed during the Blair years, but that's got nothing to do with him.
Yes, good point.
And it's the big thing that the really major change. But other than that, Blair's contribution is his legacy is hard to see apart from devolution. I guess is the big deal, and that didn't go in the way that he wanted either.
Yes, because that was supposed to be a transformative project, and it's ended up with the nationalists in power in Scotland, which was the opposite of what was intended. It was designed to arrest the advance of the nationalists. Hasn't necessarily worked. The book is, I mean, I suppose, right in the middle of it, and dividing the period very neatly is the financial crisis, because for the first half of the period you're dealing with in your new book, the economy is still growing and things appear to be relatively healthy. Then there's a financial crisis, and then it's not. We're into an age of austerity, and economics is back as a subject. It's not a problem that's been solved. It's a problem once again. What impact does that have, do you think? I mean, it clearly has an impact on what follows in terms of referendums, populism, all of that, which we'll come to. But how do you rate it in terms of its consequence?
I think it's another one where we had got used to the idea of economic growth because we'd had an end to boom and bust, as we had been regularly told, and the economy had been growing most of the major premiership and right the way through Tony Blair's time. I mean, he jumped at exactly the right point in those terms. But I think it's to do with how it was then handled. It felt as if bankers had misbehaved and we were paying the price for it. And normally with recessions, it's very difficult to know what's caused it. And there's myriad influences, and it's all a bit nebulous, and we just deal with the situation that we find ourselves in. But this time round, it felt as if there was a culprit, and it felt as if there was no justice because those culprits weren't held to account, and instead the rest of the country went into recession and paid the price and continues to do so. I mean, we haven't recovered properly from that recession and that crash. And I think that happens on Gordon Brown's watch. Gordon Brown is supposed to be the great economic administrator, one of the great only spent 10 years as Chancellor. It was clearly happening on his watch. And then he becomes Prime Minister and the crash happens. And it doesn't seem as if any lessons have been learned. From the public's perspective, it feels as if all the effort is into trying to put the system back where it was before, as though it was working fine. And I think there's a sense of injustice about that, I think, that the public felt. And that hit Gordon Brown particularly hard because he's not only the great financial administrator, but also the man who believes in social justice. And it felt as if we'd been betrayed by him as well.
Mm. To what extent is it tied up, do you think, with notions of globalisation and the idea that in the run-up to the crisis, Britain had obviously, in this new age of globalisation, Britain had a booming financial services sector, and we seem to have internationalised the economy, or certainly the financial and services part of it. And then actually when it hits, it's a national problem, isn't it? And taxpayers are on the hook, and there's understandable resentment.
Yes, I think there is. I think there's a great deal of resentment, and it's a hard one to take because it doesn't seem as if we'd done anything wrong ourselves. It wasn't that we had been overspending, although probably that was also the case, but that's not how it felt. It didn't feel as if we had any culpability in this. And I think it is important that it's international, because I think that's also part of what runs through this period, and for some time before, is a British people that don't really care a great deal about the rest of the world. I mean, and I don't mean that in a negative sense, but they think that the job of politics is to look after ourselves at home and not to worry about what's happening everywhere else. And that interconnectivity that has grown up, that globalisation, doesn't seem to have done us any favours. I think it's how it's seen, and so it's kind of the economic side of the Blair's desire to be on the world stage and to be a major player in international politics. I don't think the public particularly wanted it to be, but there is that sense of a governing class that is out of touch with the wishes of the people. The people don't want to be big and noisy in the world, and that's what the entire governing class is about. I have a quote early on from Chris Patten saying that if we don't join the euro, then we'll lose our place, and we'll lose our sense of importance, and we'll lose the sense of mattering. And I don't think the British people really wanted to matter very much, and that's why we weren't entirely behind the idea of throwing our weight around in Iraq, or indeed in global economic markets. It all kind of ties in that the governing class's eyes are on a much bigger scale.
Yeah, it's interesting, but Blair's speeches, and I sat through quite a few of them in that period as a political journalist. You know, in his pomp, half of the speech at least would be about that global challenge, and would be about Africa or global reform, and it all just seemed, I suppose, at the time, slightly quixotic. And you're right, not really the focus of where the voters were. That will come later to populism and the beginnings of what then happened. But I suppose what you're describing does feed directly into that, doesn't it? The rise of UKIP, the rise of a new kind of conservatism, and what then manifests itself in the referendum.
I think so. I think it's to a large extent because the book ends in 2015 with the re-election of David Cameron as Prime Minister. It's obviously up to the eve of the referendum, and to a large extent the book is a kind of the road to Brexit without mentioning Brexit. But I think you can see the seeds of why this is going wrong from the government's perspective, and why the referendum may well produce a result that they're not expecting.
Well, that was one of my strong feelings, reading the book, was actually, it's not a surprise then Brexit happened when you consider everything at play here in terms of loss of authority, decline in belief in experts, erosion of trust in the political and media class and expertise. Put all of that together, plus a financial crisis, and you have the ingredients. It's extraordinary then that Remain was so confident of winning, actually holding the referendum in itself. When you look back with hindsight at all the factors, seems mad.
Seeming to think that it would be sufficient to just say this is what we recommend and we know.
Yes.
But at a stage where we didn't care what they know. We had no interest in what they know because we didn't believe them. And I think that's, it does seem to me that that's part of it. And maybe it's not. Maybe it shouldn't have come as a great surprise. The straws were in the wind. You could see.
Another very strong theme in the book is class, and this idea of class tensions or changes in the class dynamic, because you describe it as posh politics, obviously Blair, Brown in the middle, but Blair to Cameron. But then underneath all of that, there is this, and you describe it brilliantly. You have a great technique in these books for drawing on popular culture and what's happening on television and broadcast media, and just what the popular conversation is as seen through TV. What do you think? What's happening in the 2000s when you see the rise of reality television, but reality television which is international but also has peculiarly British characteristics? In our case, what's bubbling away under the surface?
I think that again is related to the birth of the internet and the wish for people to have a say in things. The idea, the whole point of a reality TV show is you get to vote on who is on your television screen. That's a reasonably novel concept. We did have talent shows in the past. We had Opportunity Knocks and New Faces in the 70s and 80s, but that was a very different thing. It required you to put postcards in the pillar boxes and all that, rather than just the instant response. And it's that instant response that changes things, that makes it means that my voice as a viewer is somehow now of great significance and importance. I'm not passively receiving this. I wish to play my part in shaping it. And if I can do that with my television, then why shouldn't I also have a direct voice in the government of the country and how things are run? I think there's that seems to be why it's important is that the reality TV genre, coinciding with the rise of the internet, gives me a voice, and then I want to extend that beyond the cultural field into the political field, possibly. I also, as a normal member of society, I don't want to get too responsible for anything. There's a limit to how far I might wish to go. Even UKIP in their manifestos tend to argue that we'll have maybe one referendum a year, or most. They don't want to go to a full Swiss model of having constant referendums on everything. I don't think we want to be, we don't actually wish to go to meetings and discuss these things necessarily. We just want to have our voices heard. There's a very powerful chapter on grooming and abusing, which deals with the various grooming scandals, and then the Savile scandal and everything that flowed from that. I was going to say it's something that goes wrong in our culture, but initially you could say it goes right, in that people are prepared to speak out and take a stand, but it then leads to some form of overreaction in the aftermath of the
the inquiries which expanded ever wider after Savile. What do you think is going on?
Well, the Savile one, there were mistakes made very clearly after the Savile story broke, and that was an overreaction, and it was because
in terms of targeting other people, you mean,
yeah,
who then
yeah,
turned out were innocent?
Yes, and were treated very badly, even as suspects. I mean, not that the police shouldn't investigate complaints, but the treatment was heavy-handed and damaged many people's lives, which didn't help. It wasn't the great scandal of it, but it compounded the scandal, and that was because they'd missed Savile, and there was a need to get somebody else instead. And I think the problem with the Savile one is it seemed implausible that nobody knew, because the whole point of this stuff that I write is I'm not a journalist, I'm not a political insider. I'm consuming my politics and observing the world in the same way as everybody else does, through my television screen and my radio set and the internet. But I'd heard those stories about Jimmy Savile. I mean, not all of the stories, obviously, but I knew enough people who reported that. The rumours were vast about Savile during his lifetime. And it seems, I think, implausible to people that nobody in positions of authority in the BBC or the NHS or the prison service or the police knew these things.
But
that feels like those institutions have failed at the most basic level of protecting children. That's extraordinary.
How can they? This is. I mean, I watched the various documentaries on it. We've all seen the Theroux documentary, I'm sure, on Savile, and you're absolutely right. And this goes back into your books, the previous books that you've written, 70s and 80s and 90s, is that it's not just that the stories weren't known, but he wasn't a particularly popular figure. He was quite a creepy figure, but nonetheless still had primetime television shows. I mean, as a child, I remember him being a really bizarre figure, and lots of people, I'm sure, their parents were critical of Savile or regarded him as a real bizarre oddity in our culture. But still, somehow, he managed to be on television screens and treated by the BBC as some kind of national treasure when he clearly wasn't. What was being buried there?
I don't know. I mean, it's hard to see him. If you're of a certain age and you grew up with him on television in the 70s and 80s, it's hard to cast oneself back into where he was at the beginning of the 1960s, when he was a reasonably young man, considerably older than most of the pop stars that he was then playing records by.
Presents the first edition of Top of the Pops from Manchester, I think, with the Stones on it.
And Top of the Pops would not have existed as an institution had Jimmy Savile not been the front man at the beginning. There were other presenters, but they didn't matter. He had a different place at that point. And then at some stage in the early 1970s, he moved beyond pop music into current affairs and an odd thing, advertised. He was the face of the seatbelt campaign. So he had a quasi state kind of place. So, and again, it just seems extraordinary that nobody had heard the story. But of course, people had heard the stories. That's why he constantly got turned down for a knighthood. When Margaret Thatcher, I think on 3 separate occasions, put him forward for a knighthood, and the Honours Committee turned it down because they said he was too dubious. The stories were around. It's impossible to believe they weren't. And the fact that was not made public until after he died, at which stage a whole load of newspaper editors said, well, of course, we did know the stories.
But as you point out in the book, then the claim was, well, look, the libel laws are so strict in this country that it couldn't possibly have been reported. Just on the wider grooming scandal, which you describe, this horror, which you describe, very well in the book. Such a difficult thing to deal with, but again, extraordinary that it happened, that it was buried.
Yes, and again, those in authority seem to turn a blind eye. And as I say, this is where it gets really visceral and personal for people, because these are children we're talking about, and if the institutions of the state are incapable of protecting our own children, then clearly they have failed very, very badly indeed, and that feeds into the much less significant elements of the BBC having messed up their presentation of the Queen doing an interview and supposedly walking out. There's trivial stories that undermine institutions, but the grooming gangs seemed to be just on a level above everything else.
And if, as you say, the state and authority can't prevent that or intervene at an earlier stage and protect children, then it feeds directly into the big theme of the book, which is that erosion of authority. What's the state for? What is authority for if it can't undertake that most basic and fundamental of missions?
Yeah, and it's the police are seen to have failed, prosecutors have failed, and political parties have chosen to look the other way, with some very important exceptions and very significant politicians who were prepared to go public, but as institutions, the political parties did not seem to be interested in this story.
But after the horror of the grooming gang story, Savile, there is then, in a classic British way, the pendulum swings, and in the aftermath, there are some injustices done to certain people, aren't there?
Indeed, yeah, and that just makes it worse. I think that people then start believing.
There's
perfectly innocent men, many of whom by this stage are really quite elderly, because they're being accused of crimes from decades before, and there seems to be a feeling of then persecuting people without sufficient grounds.
Yeah. The Olympics obviously features, and that's a great moment of national optimism, isn't it?
That is, in the same way that in the 1970s the country comes together for the Silver Jubilee of the Queen. There is, in the midst of all the crises of the time, there's the 2012 Olympics, which everybody assumes is going to be a complete disaster, and it's going to be cack-handed, and we're going to make a mess of it because we're no good at these things, and turns out to be remarkably successful.
Yeah.
Not necessarily in terms of sporting excellence. It's not one of the great Olympic Games. I mean, we see it as such because it was held here, but if you were not British, then this was not one of the greatest games there's ever been. This is not right with the previous one in Beijing, which was a much more impressive occasion. But the staging of it is very successful. The opening ceremony, I think, enters popular culture folklore as a great moment. The Paralympics is a genuinely great sporting occasion. It's the best Paralympics has been held. And again, a fantastic opening ceremony for that as well. It feels like things work.
And it's a moment of, I mean, I was pretty skeptical in the run up to it and was completely wrong. And it turned out to be an enormously successful national moment. It
helped, of course, because the Queen plays an important role in the opening ceremony.
Yes.
And also helped because G4S, who was supposed to be providing the security, failed to do so, and so the army had to be called in. And so the institutions that we do have respect for, the armed forces and the monarchy, they're up front on the Olympics, and they make sure that it works. It kind of reinforces their position.
Yeah, it feels like an optimistic moment for Team GB, and the flag is the flag is reborn. And then, of course, the union's tested in 2014, and has a narrow escape. But then, just on final question, just on Europe, because then everything points towards, as you say, the referendum, which is not in the book because this is a book about the 15 years that precede it. But it's very clear in the way that the way that the book is constructed, that it's all pointing to some sort of clash or moment of fissure or resolution on Europe. Europe is one of the big underlying themes.
Yeah, and some of that obviously is in retrospect, because I'm aware that we did have a referendum eventually. It could have gone in a different way, I think. I mean, the hero, I'm not sure that's the right word, but the main character in the book, I think, is probably Nigel Farage rather than Tony Blair. I think he's a far more influential politician. But
I mean, I agree. I'm not a Farage fan at all. I've criticised him endlessly in print down the years, but he is the most consequential political figure of that period and what immediately follows the end of the book.
Yeah, no, I think so. I mean, I said earlier that Tony Blair didn't really change the country a great deal. Farage definitely did, and it may well be that. I mean, this is so early. As we said at the beginning, it's not really history somehow. But it may well be that when we do actually look at it as proper history, that this was a positive thing. That by focusing all the discontent on this one issue, Farage meant that ensured that it was not focused somewhere else. It is perfectly possible, I think, without Farage banging on about the bureaucrats in Brussels, who I think are a nice, safe, easy target, and we're not really going to do them any harm. Another populist leader might well have focused instead on ethnic minorities in Britain. This would not have been an unreasonable target for a populist politician to be overtly racist. I mean, that's certainly where we were with the rise of the BNP when it achieved nearly 1 million votes in the 2009 European elections. That was an alternative way of people expressing their discontent and finding a metaphor for everything else, because I think that ultimately that's what the Brexit vote was a metaphor for everything else having gone wrong. But I think it's a reasonably safe one. I think it, as I say, it is. I can see that it may well be seen as a good safety valve. That if all we did with this massive wave of disillusion and discontent was to leave the European Union, well, that's not as bad as it might have been.
How do you feel about Britain over the course of the books that you've written? From the 70s, they obviously the books fit together. They tell a bigger story about Britain than the individual volumes. How do you feel about how Britain is placed now? As you say, you're a historian, not a political commentator. But is it, over the course of the last 50 years or so, is Britain well positioned, or has it made a hash of things?
I think it's done okay in the sense that we are, during my lifetime, we have lost most of an empire. I mean, a chunk of it had been lost before my lifetime, but even within my life, when I was born, we still had an empire. And negotiating that and the consequent change of position in the world, I think is being handled reasonably well, considering the political, despite all the loss of faith in institutions, they are still broadly working.
Yeah.
I do point out that we came very close to Scotland deciding to leave the Union, and it was a vote. It was not the last time anybody tried to leave the Union was a century ago now, and it ended with thousands of deaths in Ireland and a continuing legacy of deaths through to modern times. We're not in that position anymore.
And also
the institutions are reasonably robust.
Yeah, so I agree on balance. It's the institutions may need reform, may need improvement, but broadly over the course of 50 years, they've adapted in a very British way by a process of evolution and bursts of reform, plus cultural power. I wouldn't wish to overstate it with the UK, and there's always a danger, isn't there? But the Brits think that the rest of the world looks too much looks more to Britain than it actually does in reality. Still, having said that, a powerful theme throughout your books is that the strength of popular culture, which is then exported through film and music and all the rest of it, and a story on integration, which of course of course there's still a hell of a lot more to do, but still compared to other powers of a similar, or countries of a similar size with a similar kind of history like France, I would say Britain's probably better positioned.
I think this is true, and I think that's kind of the point I was trying to make about how Brexit may yet be seen as a safety valve. That when it is perfectly possible that France, Italy, Spain, Germany face much worse problems, and if we got over venting our anger, as I say, through hurling abuse at some bureaucrats in Brussels, and that's not so bad. Yeah. But all those institutions were made for an imperial power, and they have to adjust accordingly. And as I say, maybe that's the problem. Is the governing class still has that image of being a major world power, and I don't think the British public do. I don't think that's what motivated people to vote Brexit was imperial nostalgia, as it's sometimes presented by hardcore Remainers. I think it's precisely the opposite. Those who wish to be in Europe wish to do so because they wanted to be big in the world. Those who wanted to leave just wanted to do some basic housekeeping.
Yeah. The notion of global Britain is really sort of tacked together by a small group of Westminster Brexiteers who are looking for a story to sell about what happens afterwards, all to be detailed, I'm sure, in your next and subsequent books, Alwyn Turner. But I just really, really enjoyed this.
Thank you.
All in it together, England in the early 21st century by Alwyn Turner. And thank you very much for joining us today. If you're not a subscriber of Reaction on YouTube, hit the subscribe button below, and also visit the site where you can become a member of Reaction. You get my weekly newsletter on politics and lots of other stuff on business, culture, economics from the Reaction team and our columnists, including Tim Marshall, Maggie Pagano, and all sorts of other great writers. Until next time, thank you very much for watching and listening.